Okay, how's everybody doing this afternoon? Good? Okay, so I want to take a little bit of time at the start of lab to go over some things that pertain to the project. And I've added a couple of things to Moodle. So I added the slides from today if anyone wants to spend more time looking at that. I'm working on a document for Ben and everyone else that's interested in worms. I've got some pretty interesting resources. There is already one paper from 2019 that I've put in the week 11 readings that is kind of a general review paper on worms and their impact on soil biota. So that's up there. Again, no expectations that anyone's going to read it necessarily, but there in case you want some to delve into that topic a little bit more. The other thing I've added at the bottom is for week 11 is something called the IMRAD writing format. And so for your project, in the end, you're going to present it in two different ways. Unless something goes very askew, the plan for our last lab, which is the week before Thanksgiving, is that you guys are going to do presentations on your projects. And those will be probably roughly 10-minute PowerPoint presentations about your projects. And I'll try to go back and find, I think I've got some examples from 2016. I'll try to find an example PowerPoint to put up so you can get a sense. But most of you have probably done PowerPoint presentations, right? In class? Yeah. So that shouldn't be too much of a problem. But you're also going to turn in a written component of this as well. And ideally, the two things can mesh pretty clearly. A PowerPoint is going to be largely visual. Rarely should you have a PowerPoint slide that's nothing but words. Sometimes that that ends up being the way you need to communicate, especially if it's like an overview slide or a conclusion slide. But for the most part, generally you want something visual to go with the words that emphasize, highlight, help explain what you're trying to convey to your listeners. But so when you do that, you're already going to have what I refer to generally as figures. So in most scientific writing, especially true in environmental science, earth science, and actually probably biology to some degree, we tend to write papers that are very visual. If you're going to write a paper about worms, as you'll see if you look at the paper I put up, they're very interesting. It's not a dry subject, really, unless the worm's been sitting out in the sun, right? Because they're always kind of points. Worm joke there. So it's not really a dry topic, but you can imagine if you had 20 pages of just text, by the 5th or 6th page, you'd be saying, gosh, it'd be nice to see a picture of this worm burrow. It'd be nice to see a picture of what that looks like. And so typically papers in earth environmental biosciences are pretty well illustrated. And that's very useful because then if you're getting figures prepared for your paper, it's pretty easy to just pop them into a PowerPoint slide, right? And so this is also, to some degree, I view it as a little bit of efficiency. And your presentation is going to be due first. Right now, we're scheduled to have practice presentations next week, and I will do an email check-in as well as a little bit today to see how people feel if you're going to have enough information to be able to do a presentation next. So the presentation next week is just with one peer, so you can have someone listen to it that's in your class that's got a similar level of knowledge that can then ask you questions, help point out places where you need to explain things more clearly, so that when you give the presentation to the class, the presentation is as good as it can be, because grades based on the presentation and the paper. But if in the end it doesn't make sense to try to do that next week, then we could probably push that back for a week. But I'll try to get a feeling for that. Then your final presentation won't be till that week. I think it's the 18th of November. It's that week if it's not that day, but it's that lab day. And so basically, by Thanksgiving, we'll have our last class the Monday of Thanksgiving week, probably, and farewell class. And there's no final exam. The day of the final exam will be the day when your paper's due. So you'll do your presentation Wednesday, the week before Thanksgiving. So you may get some feedback questions, things like that, if there's any last minute things you need to check on. And then the paper won't be due until the week after Thanksgiving. So hopefully that gives everyone plenty of time. And also, because your talk is due before then, hopefully you'll have most of the work done, so you won't have to spend your Thanksgiving working on paper for this class. At any rate, hopefully you can take some time off and relax. But what I wanted to do is I did want to quickly go through a little bit of the writing, because probably you all have written scientific papers. Yeah, the people I see heads moving. So this may be something I can go through really quickly then. And for people that want to ask questions, that's fine. But this is a handout that a colleague gave me many years ago, designed to help students learn sort of the scientific writing format. And we call it the IMRAD format. And that stands for Introduction, Methods, Results, and Discussion. And it's one of the things I think that makes scientific writing relatively easier. Like, I still struggle to write papers. Sometimes it takes me a long time, and I still write papers. I've probably written 50 or 60 journal papers in my career, plus half a book. And writing, I know, is sometimes still a struggle for me. So, you know, one of the things I end up doing that kind of helps get me going in writing, I use a lot of outlines, because sitting down writing 10 pages to me is intimidating. Like, I can do that in 2 or 3 hours sometimes if it's a topic I know really well, but it's intimidating. And on the other hand, I can make an outline for a paper on almost any topic you could give me in 5 minutes. And it may be a really simple outline that in the end, it may not look a lot like the paper, but an outline really is just a way to organize your thoughts. And so when I'm writing, I find that I use this as a way to brainstorm. And sometimes I kick things out as I revise outlines. But if I start off with a basic outline, it's easy to go in even for 5 or 10 minutes when I get an idea and put a couple bullet points in, save it, and then come back to it the next day. So I find it easier for me. You guys all are going to have your own methods, but this is a little bit of insight into the Ben method of writing papers. So I use outlines a lot, and then I tend to make my figures and data tables before I write the paper. Because again, because we're using illustrations, you know, Odin's going to have some maps and maybe even some pictures from his grandpa's farm. Well, part of the paper is going to be describing the things that might be shown in those pictures. So literally, the way I learned in my PhD to write papers is we made all the figures and tables first. Because then as we're writing the paper, one, you want to make sure you integrate the figures into the text seamlessly. But two, a lot of what you're doing is you're describing in the paper the things you're showing in the figures. And to me, at least, figure making is a little bit less intimidating. And so I can usually flesh out all the figures for a paper, or at least most of the ones I need if I've got data, arrange it in data tables. And then I sit down to do the detailed writing, and I've used my illustrations to help me organize my thoughts and make sure I've collected all the data I need. So that method doesn't work for everyone, but if you haven't tried it before, it certainly works for me. And it means I can jump into it at any point, and I don't feel like, oh gosh, I need 4 hours because I've got to write 10 pages. I can jump in and say, well, I have 15 minutes, but I can sort of add a few more bullet points to this one section, and it makes it easier to come back and just do little bits. And in the end, if you've got a 2 or 3 page or 4 page detailed outline, by the time you turn the bullet points into sentences, you've got a 5 or 6 page paper. Anyway, that's my general philosophy. And what I want to do is quickly go through this IMRAD format. I'll try to just do it very quickly because a lot of you are familiar with this, but raise your hand or wave at me if you have any questions as we're going through this, and I'm happy to take another minute and go through this. Like I said, this is on Moodle as well if you want to look at it. This started from my friend John Weber, who's at Grand Valley State University, and he took a lot of this from a book on how to write a scientific paper, and it's been modified over the years. Okay, so a couple of important things. Preparation of scientific paper has less to do with literary skill than organization. And you know that's very much true. It's a little bit unfortunate that sometimes when you're reading a paper, you wish that they would have put a little bit more literary skill into it. But that's also why we've talked about reading papers. You know, you read a paper very much the way you write it. You don't sit down and read the first word and read it end to end generally. It's very rare that I do that with a paper. I look through it quickly first and look at the component parts of it, and then I decide where I need to focus depending on sort of the point I have for reading the paper. And it's easy to do that generally because when you're writing in this IMRAD format, you use a lot of subheadings. And that means it's easy to look through the paper and very quickly see the structure because you don't have to go into the detailed text of paragraphs to try to figure out what's going on. You've got in general this heading structure. Yeah, generally it follows, you know, what's the problem, how is it studied, what are the findings, and what do they mean? So that's sort of the general idea. Paper should always have a title. Generally, it should have an abstract, which is a general map for readers. So it's basically a summary, but it maybe emphasizes a little bit more details about results. For example, like in the abstract, it's okay to have a sentence that says, you know, I was growing rye plants in soils with different fertilizers, and group 1, the average height was 2 centimeters, group 2, 5. So it's actually okay to put data from your results into an abstract. You don't want to put all of it, but your most important data you might want to put in the abstract because the abstract may be the first thing that people actually read. And then you also, the conclusions also, unlike a lot of other styles of writing where, you know, when you get to the end of the mystery, if you read a mystery book, the conclusion is kind of the reveal at the end where they tie everything together. And to some degree, conclusions in a scientific paper are really restating things that the reader should already know from the paper. And so the conclusions oftentimes are relatively short, and because you've already led the reader to these conclusions in the discussion part of the paper. Okay, so introduction is after the abstract and title, and obviously your name, which should be on here as well. The introduction should actually really say what is the purpose of the paper. And there's, you know, different papers can have different purposes. Some of you are doing GIS mapping, some of you are doing experiments. And so the purpose of those papers is going to be somewhat different. And so that'll influence how much information you have in the introduction. But people should know by the end of your introduction what the purpose of your paper is. And oftentimes it ends up being sort of the last sentence or two of the introduction is literally the purpose of this paper is, in this paper we find, in this paper we explore. And so it's obvious to the reader at the end of the introduction, you know, why they should read the paper. Methods. This section really depends on what you're doing. A couple of people that are doing experiments are going to need to describe briefly what the methods are that they used for designing their experiments, how they mixed soils, how they made measurements. In GIS, if you're doing a GIS project, you don't need to go into the details of step 1, I opened a link on the web, step 2, I drug the shapefile in, right? You don't need to go into those details. But if there's any, you certainly want to list the data sets from which you pulled. And if there's any special things you did, any special plugins you use for the GIS or something like that, you might want to mention that as well. Anything that's not a really standard technique, you might mention in the methods section. The methods section is really mostly important if you've collected a lot of data in a unique way, because a lot of data collection techniques are really standardized. So in the methods section, you might just say, I followed the methods of Strock et al. 2025 for measuring the length of nostoc in lakes in Iceland. And you know, then people would know to go to the Strock paper and there would be a detailed discussion of what those methods are, but you don't need to repeat those methods in your paper unless you've done something different. Results. This is the core of the paper. Doesn't necessarily mean it's the longest part of the paper, but this is where you are telling people what your results are. And a very important but significant subtle thing that you've got to keep in mind, this is not where you explain the origin of your results. The results section is just about description. And that's very important, and it's a tough lesson. It takes a while for people to learn because a lot of times the inclination is to be interpreting the data as you're describing it. But the problem with science is if 10 people do the same experiment over 10 different years, they're going to potentially get 10 different answers, and they may have 20 different explanations. And the truth is, if you collect your data really well, if you're measuring the height that plants as they're growing, one, you're going to be the only person that ever measures the heights of those plants. Because at the end of your experiment, you're going to pull the plants up to make other measurements, and then the experiment's over, and no one has that data. So it's important to preserve and present your data. Can be true with GIS. Like every time you make a soils map, if you bring that into the GIS, you might decide to calculate the perimeter of the polygons. Well, no one may have ever calculated the perimeter of those exact polygons that you put into your GIS. And if you're doing land classification and you're making your own outlines of things, that is a primary data analysis point that you're doing that maybe no one else has ever done and maybe no one else will ever do. So you want to make sure you describe that data and you report that data very objectively. The results section of a good paper, the data should be usable forever if you do it properly. The interpretation of the data may totally change and get thrown out. We may discover some new law of soil mechanics in 5 years that means we have to totally reinterpret every earthworm hole we've ever seen, right? But if we've done a good job collecting the data on how deep the earthworm holes are and how wide they are, that data can be reinterpreted in a new model if the data is not biased and tied up and mixed in with interpretations. So the results is all about describing the data you have collected, the data analysis you've done, but it's not about interpretation. Okay? The interpretation part of the paper comes in the discussion. And sometimes that means there's a little bit of repetition. Sometimes in some parts of a paper, sometimes I'll have subheadings in the results. You know, results 1, measurement of earthworm burrows. Results section 2, measurement of earthworm lengths. You know, section 3, measurement of earthworm mass, whatever. And you can certainly have subheadings in these major sections. And then if I find I need to discuss, I'm going to interpret each one of those sets of results, I sometimes copy the results section, paste it in the discussion, so I have the exact same format. A lot of times with reading papers, if you have some symmetry of organization, it makes it easier for the reader to follow. You don't have to, but you can do that, especially as a start. And then the discussion is where you might say, oh, well, okay, I measured 50 worm burrows and the average length was 10 centimeters, but it was all in the Duffield soil, and I know that's a clay-rich soil. So my interpretation is that the worm burrows were only that deep because they were trying to go through a clay-rich soil that's got a hard pan at 10 centimeters. That's an interpretation of my data to try to explain the data. Someone else might come along and say, well, actually, that soil is misclassified. It's not Duffield, and it doesn't really have that clay content. And so they might make a different interpretation to explain the exact same observation that the worm burrows are on average 10 centimeters deep. Okay. So it's very important in science, and probably other fields as well, but we really talk about this in science, to keep your data and your results and the description of that clearly separate from the interpretations. Okay. And if you do that, you can still feel good. I mean, maybe your interpretations are right, maybe they're wrong. I mean, you guys are not, even though all your projects, you may actually be the person that knows the most about the project that you do, because no one else may have done the same project. You know, the truth is none of you are experts in soil science. None of you are experts in GIS or in farming or whatever. And I don't expect that. And so I don't expect your interpretations to necessarily, I'm not going to judge them as being right or wrong. They should be consistent with your results. Right? So if I don't find any worms in my study that weigh more than 10 grams, and then in my discussion, I say, well, actually, I suspect that there are wild beaver that invade this area and eat all the big worms. Well, if I don't find beaver footprints, if I don't find beaver tracks, if it's not in a place where there's a stream with beaver dams, like why, that doesn't make any sense to try to come up with that explanation. It's just an ad hoc thing that I'm basically making up. So you want to make sure that your interpretation in the discussions should actually be consistent to the best of your ability with your results. And you know, and in this part of the paper, you do have the freedom to speculate somewhat, as long as the speculations can be linked back to your data in some series of steps. So you don't have, but you don't have to be, you want them to be consistent, you don't have to be overly concerned. But you do want them very separate from your results, and you want your results to be as accurate as possible. I should go back and be able to do any of your experiments in your GIS measurements, and I should be able to get basically the same results if you've done and reported your results properly. But I may have different interpretations, and that doesn't mean mine are better than yours or right or wrong. But I may just look at things in a different way, or I may have a different set of experiences. Oh, okay, does that make sense to everybody? I don't want to belabor any of these points, but I do want you to do well. I want these to be good papers and good projects. I want you to be happy with them, and I want to be happy with them. So I want to make sure that we have clarity of kind of expectations. So the next thing is, obviously, you need to do a good job with references. It's one of the trickier things about being in an academic setting. We care sometimes maybe too much, but we really care about people giving people credit for their ideas. And for the most part, it's important, for sure. But in the academic world, we really emphasize that. So it's really important, one, that you have done some background research on your project. It can be about soil types. It can be about what grows where. It can be about many different things. And if you're having a problem figuring out what to do with background research, for sure you should email me, or we can talk about it, and I will help get you started. But the critical thing then is how you actually acknowledge information from other sources in the paper. And you're always better to oversight than to undercite. Okay? And generally, we use a relatively simple citation method that's not too painful. In the social sciences, where you got to use all these footers and all that it's such a pain to format it, and it's ridiculous to spend time doing something that's painful like that. So we use a really simple system that's called parenthetical citation. And essentially, what you do generally is you give the names of the authors, the last names of the authors, no initials, and then the date of publication. If there's more than 2 authors, you can just say et al. You don't have to list them all. And then, of course, in the reference sections at the end of the paper, the references cited, you give the full citation. You can use websites, but you should also have some journal articles to back up some of your information that you're looking at. In part because like I could make a website on the how you ride elephants, and I have ridden an elephant once way back in Michigan at a farm. They had this little fair thing, and I took my kids on it. But I'm by no way and no means am I an expert in riding elephants. That does not stop me from buying the domain name elephants.com and writing all kinds of things about elephants and how to ride them, even if I know nothing. And sometimes it can be tricky. Several years ago, I was looking at online geography textbooks, and I found an online book that was free, and I thought, well, maybe I can use this as a resource. And I started reading through the rock and mineral section of the book, and I was like, what is this? This is not right. This is wrong. And it was written by a professor of geography. So you look at who's written, it's like, well, this is a legitimate professor at school. I emailed the guy, and the guy was like, oh, thanks for pointing that out. Yeah, I'm not an expert in rocks and minerals, but I needed a section in my book on this. So, it'd be great if you could go through all the chapters. It's like, well, sorry, I pointed out a few things, but I don't have time to review your book for you. But the point is, you have to be very careful about your sources. And one of the reasons why it's useful to get sources from peer-reviewed scientific journals is typically that means they have had outside reviewers read the paper, and whoever wrote the paper had to respond to that. And so it's kind of like it's been fact-checked. And one thing that's not always clear, I think, these days with students, there are lots and lots of online journal articles. So the article I just put up on worms that I found today is in a journal called Frontiers Inner Sciences. That is a journal article. It is cited just like you would cite a journal article that in my day, a long time ago, we walked over to the library, went down to the basement and pulled out a dusty volume and opened it up and put it on a photocopier and made a copy. Right? It's the same thing. It's just electronic. So you don't cite that by putting the URL of the website. Almost all journal articles, you can find a citation that's just like the old style citations you see in the back of papers. And just because you got it from a website, if it's a journal website, you cite the journal, you don't cite the website, okay? There are some other kinds of information from the government, things like that, where you might use a URL in your citation. But for journal articles, you shouldn't do that, and you don't need to do that. And if you get a journal article and you're unsure how to cite it, just send me a quick email and I'll pop onto it quickly and help you find it. Because sometimes it is definitely more confusing nowadays than it used to be to find some of the citation information. But you always are better to oversight than to undercite. And there are also different methods about how you can actually add citations to papers. We don't need to talk too much about this with their examples, but sometimes it's even useful to, yeah, this is an important thing to point out. There are ways to shorten the citations. If you have a whole paragraph, if I said, to make my worm burrow measurements, I followed the 5-step procedure from Smith et al., 1950. And then I say step 1, blah, 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 step 2, blah, 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 right? It's very clear to the reader that each of those 5 steps came from that source because I told the reader that is the source for these 5 steps. So I don't need to put Smith et al. 1950 behind each step because I've already told the reader explicitly that those steps came from that source. What you can't do is say, I used a 5-step method to measure my worms, give the 5 steps, and at the end of the last step, put Smith et al. 1955. Because the citation, when you put it at the end of the sentence, it only applies to that one sentence unless you tell the reader. And if you tell the reader that you got all these 5 steps from this source at the beginning, or at the end, but probably you want to do it at the beginning, then that's fine. Then you can just put the reference in once. But if you don't tell the reader that ahead of time, then you would have to say Smith et al. Behind every sentence if each one of those steps came from that article. And you can also, you don't always have to use the parenthetical citations. This is a little bit of sort of literary style. You could also say Smith et al. 1950 presented 5 different methods for measuring worms, right? And you can actually let them be, let the whoever the previous researcher was, let them be doing the action in the sentence, and that's okay too. You can actually incorporate them into the sentence. It doesn't always have to be parenthetical at the end. So there's some ways you can sort of vary up the way you use citations in the paper, but the key thing is just to always cite. And if you ever have a question about a paragraph or a sentence, just email me and I'll help you through it. It's one of those little weird sticky things in the academic world in particular that you just want to make sure you know how to get right. And I'm happy to help. Okay, we don't use quotes very much in science, but if you do, you know, there are proper ways to do that. Yeah, I think that's mostly the end of what I had to say. So what about questions? Is all of this stuff you've heard 20 times and you're all good with it, or do you have any specific questions about these sections in writing? Silence? Silence means that you're all good, which is good. Okay, anyways, that document's online under week 11, so you've got that to look at if you want to go through and review it. And like I said, just email if you have questions. I'm happy to talk about any of this stuff. Okay, so that is it for the formal part of lab. I will be hanging out for the next 2.5 hours, and anyone that wants to either stay online or sort of pop in and out and ask questions about project data collection, background research, or whatever, you know where I'll be. I'll be right here. And if you're feeling good and you got lots of stuff to do, you just want to keep your head down and work, go for it. And I will see you Friday if you don't have any questions. Okay.
Thanks, Ben.